Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that touches every single one of our lives, yet in medieval times was so bizarre it would make your worst night of tossing and turning look like a five-star hotel experience. We're talking about sleep, medieval sleep, and trust me, it was weird. Before we begin this journey through the strange world of medieval bedtimes, take a moment to get comfortable. Pull up that blanket, adjust your pillow, maybe dim the lights a bit. If you enjoy these deep dives into history's oddest corners, a like genuinely helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I always love hearing where you're listening from in the comments, so drop a line and let me know what time it is in your part of the world. Tonight, we're going to explore how people in the Middle Ages approached something as fundamental as going to sleep. From their utterly bizarre sleep schedules that would horrify modern sleep experts, to sleeping arrangements that would make a college dorm room look luxurious, to bedtime rituals that sound more like medieval torture than rest and relaxation. So settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's travel back to a time when getting a good night's sleep was complicated, dangerous, and occasionally involved sharing your bed with livestock. Picture this. It's a winter evening in 1347, somewhere in rural England. The sun has set, which means it's probably around 4 p.m., because medieval winters were basically extended periods of darkness punctuated by brief moments of dim daylight. You're getting ready for bed, but you're not planning to sleep until morning like a reasonable person. No, you're about to embark on what medieval people considered perfectly normal. A two-part sleep system that would make modern sleep specialists question everything they know about human rest. Medieval people didn't sleep the way we do. They didn't collapse into bed at 11 p.m. and hope to wake up 8 hours later feeling refreshed. Instead, they practiced something called segmented sleep, or divided sleep, and it was exactly as strange as it sounds. Here's how it worked. As soon as darkness fell, people would head to bed for what they called first sleep. This wasn't because they were particularly tired or because there was nothing else to do, though both were often true. It was because light was expensive, heat was precious, and entertainment options were limited to whatever stories Uncle Wilhelm could remember from the last traveling minstrel. First sleep lasted about 4 hours. Just 4 hours. Then, somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. people would wake up. Not because of a crying baby or a full bladder, though those certainly happened. They woke up because their bodies were programmed to wake up. This wakeful period had a name. The watch. The watch wasn't considered a sleep disorder or a sign of poor health. It was the schedule. During this midnight interlude, medieval people would do the most remarkable things. They'd pray, naturally, because prayer was woven into every aspect of medieval life like a thread through fabric. They'd tend to their fires, checking to make sure the embers hadn't died completely and that nothing flammable had caught spark. They'd check on their animals because livestock weren't just possessions in the medieval world. They were investment portfolios with legs. A dead cow meant financial ruin. A sick pig meant no bacon come winter. So people would venture into the cold darkness, often barefoot, to make sure their four-legged assets were still breathing. But here's where it gets really interesting. Medieval medical texts and marriage manuals specifically recommended the watch period for intimate relations. The logic, according to learned physicians of the time, was that people were rested from first sleep, but not yet heavy with the drowsiness that would come with second sleep. They were, supposedly, in the perfect state of mind and body for what medieval writers delicately referred to as conjugal duties. Think about that for a moment. These people scheduled romance for the middle of the night, in freezing cold bedrooms, after getting up to check on goats. Medieval marriage advice was apparently written by people who had never experienced the simple pleasure of sleeping through the night. The watch period typically lasted 1 to 2 hours, though in winter it might stretch longer because, frankly, what else were you going to do in the middle of a freezing medieval night? Some people would read by candlelight, assuming they could read and could afford candles, both significant assumptions in medieval times. Others would lie in bed, talking to their sleeping companions, and yes, we'll get to the horror of medieval sleeping arrangements later. Religious people used this time for additional prayers. Monks had an entire church service called matins, scheduled specifically for the middle of the night. Picture this. At 2 a.m., Bells would ring throughout monasteries, and dozens of monks would shuffle out of their dormitories in rough wool robes, march to a stone chapel with no heating, and spend an hour chanting Latin prayers while their breath formed visible clouds in the frigid air. Then they'd shuffle back to bed for round 2 of sleep, because apparently medieval monks thought regular sleep was too easy and needed to add a middle-of-the-night religious service to really make it challenging. After the watch period ended, people would settle back into what they called second sleep, which would last until dawn. This meant that a full night's rest was actually 2 separate chunks of sleep with a wakeful period in between, like a sleep sandwich with a layer of consciousness in the middle. This wasn't just some quirky habit practiced by a few eccentric medieval villages. Segmented sleep was documented across all of medieval Europe. French texts refer to premier sommeil and second sommeil. Italian sources mention primo sonno and secondo sonno. German manuscripts describe erster Schlaf and zweiter Schlaf. Even as late as Shakespeare's time, references to first and second sleep appear casually in literature, suggesting that educated audiences understood these terms without explanation. But why did medieval people sleep this way? The simple answer is that they didn't really have a choice. Before artificial lighting, human sleep patterns were entirely governed by natural light cycles. In winter, nights could last 14 hours or more. Trying to sleep straight through that entire period wasn't just difficult. It was physiologically unnatural. Modern sleep researchers have actually studied this phenomenon. When people are isolated from artificial light and electric clocks, placed in environments that mimic medieval lighting conditions, they naturally develop segmented sleep patterns remarkably similar to what medieval people practiced. The human body, it turns out, may be wired for divided sleep when not influenced by modern lighting. The transition between first and second sleep wasn't always smooth. Medieval texts describe people who had trouble falling back asleep during the watch period. These unfortunate souls would lie awake for hours, staring into the darkness, contemplating their sins, worrying about their crops, or wondering if that suspicious cough from the cow meant impending financial disaster. Medieval insomnia was just as real as modern insomnia, except the solutions were prayer, herbal remedies that were probably more dangerous than helpful, and occasionally more prayer. Some people never fully adapted to segmented sleep. Chronicles describe individuals who would sleep straight through both periods, much to the concern of their families. Oversleeping was considered a sign of laziness, illness, or moral deficiency. If you couldn't wake up for the watch, you were either dying or lacking in character, possibly both. The watch period also served practical purposes beyond prayer and intimacy. This was when people would check their homes for signs of fire, which was a genuine and constant concern when your house was made of wood, thatch, and hope, and heated by open flames. Families would designate someone to stay alert during the watch, ensuring that everyone was still breathing and that the roof wasn't quietly smoldering. Medieval mothers used the watch to tend to young children. This was when they'd check on infants, change crude cloth diapers, nurse babies, or simply ensure that their children were still alive. Child mortality was so high that parents lived in constant fear of finding a cold, still form in the morning. Children were trained in segmented sleep from early childhood. Medieval parents would wake their young ones during the watch period to use chamber pots, say prayers, or simply reinforce the family's sleep schedule. This meant that medieval children grew up chronically sleep-deprived by modern standards, which probably contributed to the general atmosphere of exhaustion that seems to have pervaded medieval life. The end of segmented sleep came gradually with improvements in artificial lighting. Better candles, oil lamps, and eventually gas lighting allowed people to stay awake later in the evening. This pushed their initial bedtime later, naturally compressing the night into a single sleep period. By the Industrial Revolution, when electric lighting became common, continuous 8-hour sleep had become the standard, and the medieval 2-sleep system was relegated to historical footnote. But for hundreds of years, millions of people lived by this bizarre schedule. They considered it completely normal to wake up in the middle of the night, have conversations, check on animals, say prayers, engage in intimate relations, and then return to sleep. To them, our modern habit of sleeping straight through the night would have seemed strange and possibly unhealthy. The segmented sleep system wasn't just about rest. It was a reflection of how medieval people organized their entire lives around the constraints of their world. No electricity meant no extended evenings. Limited heating meant conserving body heat was crucial. Constant threats to health and property meant vigilance was necessary even during sleep. Medieval people didn't sleep for comfort or rejuvenation the way we do. They slept for survival, and even sleep itself required careful management and constant attention. Now that we've covered the bizarre timing of medieval sleep, let's talk about where these people actually tried to get their rest. And when I say rest, I'm using the term very generously, because medieval beds were essentially elaborate torture devices designed by someone who clearly had never experienced the concept of comfort. Let's start with the peasants, who made up roughly 90% of the medieval population. Their sleeping surfaces were called pallets, which sounds quaint and rustic until you realize that a pallet was basically a sack stuffed with whatever organic refuse they could scrape together. We're talking about straw, hay, dried grass, rushes, moss, leaves, and occasionally, if they were feeling particularly luxurious, sheep's wool that still smelled like the sheep. The straw they used wasn't the clean golden straw you might see in a harvest festival display. This was straw that had been lying around in fields, barns, and storage areas for months, accumulating dirt, animal droppings, insects, mold, and various unidentifiable organic matter. It was scratchy, often damp, frequently infested with vermin, and always uncomfortable. The sack containing this delightful mixture was made from coarse burlap, rough linen, or whatever sturdy fabric the family could acquire. Sometimes these sacks were repurposed grain bags that still carried the aroma of whatever had been stored in them previously. Imagine trying to sleep on a mattress that smelled like old wheat, barley, and the accumulated scents of a medieval granary. Here's where things get truly unpleasant. These pallets were rarely changed or refreshed. Straw was valuable, and replacing mattress filling wasn't something you did casually. Families might use the same straw for months, even entire seasons. Over time, the filling would compress into hard, lumpy masses. It would begin to decompose, creating a kind of compost situation right underneath sleeping bodies. The straw would become home to entire ecosystems of insects, rodents, and microorganisms. The insect situation deserves special attention because it was truly horrific. Medieval mattresses were five-star hotels for fleas, lice, bedbugs, and various other parasites that treated human blood like an all-night buffet. Fleas were so common in medieval bedding that they were simply accepted as part of the sleeping experience. People would go to bed knowing they'd wake up covered in fresh flea bites, and there wasn't much they could do about it except scratch and endure. Bedbugs were somehow even worse than fleas. These clever little vampires would burrow deep into the straw during daylight hours, then emerge at night to feast on sleeping humans. Medieval people would wake up covered in welts and sores, but they didn't have modern pest control methods. The best they could manage was occasionally burning bundles of aromatic herbs like wormwood or lavender around the bed, which probably accomplished nothing except making their sleeping area smell like a medieval apothecary shop. Lice completed this unholy trinity of sleep-disrupting parasites. They would live in the straw, in the bedding, in people's hair, and in their clothing. Medieval people were essentially walking lice habitats, and their beds served as the main breeding and feeding grounds for these persistent little creatures. But the horror doesn't end with insects. These pallets weren't elevated off the ground like modern mattresses. They were placed directly on the floor, which in medieval homes was usually packed dirt, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. This meant that moisture from the ground would seep upward into the mattress, creating perfect conditions for mold, mildew, and rot. The floors themselves were problematic. Medieval homes didn't have solid foundations or waterproof flooring. The packed dirt would become muddy when it rained. Animals would track in mud, manure, and worse. People would spill food, drinks, urine, vomit, and various other bodily fluids. All of this would eventually work its way into the sleeping area, creating a kind of medieval swamp directly beneath where people were trying to rest. Some slightly more prosperous peasants managed to elevate their pallets on simple wooden frames. These weren't elegant bed frames. They were crude constructions made from rough-hewn planks, often uneven and prone to collapse without warning. The frame might lift the mattress a few precious inches off the ground, but it also created perfect hiding spots for rodents, insects, and the occasional snake that wandered in looking for warmth. Pillows, as we understand them, simply didn't exist for most medieval people. If you were extraordinarily lucky, you might have a small sack filled with feathers scavenged from chickens or geese. More likely, you'd rest your head on a bundle of straw, a folded cloak, or simply find the least uncomfortable lump in your mattress. The concept of soft, supportive head and neck comfort was a luxury so far beyond most people's reach that they probably didn't even dream about it. Medieval blankets were their own category of misery. Wool was the primary material, but medieval wool wasn't the soft, processed fabric we know today. It was coarse, scratchy, and retained the strong, unmistakable smell of sheep. These blankets were rarely washed because heating water was difficult, soap was expensive and caustic, and drying heavy wool fabric in medieval conditions was nearly impossible. A typical family might share a single blanket among multiple people. Parents, children, and possibly extended family members would huddle together under one piece of scratchy, smelly wool. Personal blankets were a luxury that most families simply couldn't afford or justify. Now let's talk about the wealthy, because surely they had better sleeping arrangements. Well, better is relative. Noble beds were certainly more elaborate, but they came with their own unique problems. Wealthy families had feather mattresses, but these weren't the clean, sanitized down comforters we know today. They were stuffed with feathers from whatever birds were available: chickens, geese, ducks, and sometimes more exotic fowl. And these feathers weren't always properly cleaned or prepared. Feather mattresses presented their own challenges. They were expensive to maintain and nearly impossible to clean thoroughly. The feathers would clump together over time, creating lumps and valleys that made sleep uncomfortable. They also retained odors, not just the smell of the original birds, but also whatever human scents accumulated over months or years of use. Wealthy beds were often massive constructions that resembled small rooms more than sleeping surfaces. They featured heavy wooden frames, elaborate curtains, and fabric canopies, but these weren't just for show. They served practical purposes. The curtains helped retain body heat in unheated bedrooms, and the canopy provided protection from insects, dust, and small animals that might fall from the rafters. The bed curtains were typically made from heavy wool or linen, and they were rarely cleaned. They would hang around the bed for years, accumulating smoke from fires, cooking odors, dust, and human scents. By modern hygiene standards, they would have been absolutely revolting, but medieval people either didn't notice or didn't have alternatives. Even wealthy beds had serious problems. The wooden frames were often infested with insects that burrowed into joints and crevices. The elaborate construction made thorough cleaning nearly impossible. Servants might change the sheets occasionally, but the underlying structure remained a breeding ground for pests and bacteria. Medieval sheets, when they existed at all, were made from coarse, scratchy linen. They weren't the smooth, comfortable fabrics we're accustomed to. They were rough textiles that would chafe against skin and catch on anything slightly abrasive. Washing them required significant time and effort, so they weren't changed frequently. A wealthy family might change their sheets a few times per year, which was considered quite luxurious. The concept of matching bedroom sets didn't exist. A medieval bed might feature a random collection of fabrics, colors, and textures, all chosen for practical rather than aesthetic reasons. Functionality was more important than beauty, and even functionality was often questionable. Bed maintenance was a constant struggle that required significant time and effort. Straw mattresses had to be periodically shaken and turned to prevent excessive compression. Feather mattresses needed regular fluffing and redistribution. Wooden frames required inspection for insect damage and structural integrity. All bedding needed regular airing to prevent moisture accumulation and odor buildup. Despite all these problems, beds were valuable possessions that families treasured and protected. They were often mentioned specifically in wills and passed down through generations like heirlooms. A well-constructed bed frame might last for decades, even if the mattress filling required periodic replacement. Wealthy families would invest substantial money in their beds, understanding that they represented a significant long-term investment. Medieval people spent approximately 1/3 of their lives in these uncomfortable, insect-infested, smelly beds. They would lie down each night knowing they'd wake up itchy, sore, and probably sporting fresh insect bites. But they didn't have alternatives. This was simply what sleep looked like in their world. The irony is that despite having such terrible beds, medieval people still managed to follow their segmented sleep schedules religiously. They would wake up in the middle of the night, conduct their watch period activities, and return to these awful sleeping surfaces for second sleep. Their dedication to this routine, despite the physical discomfort, suggests just how ingrained the practice had become in medieval culture. When we hear nightcap today, most of us think of a drink before bed. Maybe something with whiskey, perhaps paired with a cozy fire and questionable life decisions. But in medieval times, a nightcap wasn't something you drank. It was something you wore on your head, and it was absolutely essential for survival. Medieval nightcaps were real, physical pieces of clothing designed to prevent your head from freezing during sleep. This wasn't vanity or fashion consciousness. This was practical survival gear for people who lived in buildings that had all the insulating properties of a tent made of sticks. Medieval homes were architectural disasters from a heating perspective. Stone walls conducted cold like they were designed for refrigeration. Thatched roofs leaked air, water, and occasionally small animals. Windows were holes in walls covered with thin animal hide, oiled parchment, or if you were wealthy, expensive glass that was still essentially transparent ice. Central heating was a concept that wouldn't exist for several centuries. The closest thing to temperature control was a fire in the main room, and even that was often allowed to die down at night to conserve fuel. Bedrooms were separate spaces, cold, damp chambers where your breath would form visible clouds and frost might form on the walls. In these conditions, body heat escaped fastest through the head, so keeping your noggin warm became a matter of life and death. Enter the medieval nightcap, a practical piece of sleep equipment that came in various styles, all of them somewhat ridiculous by modern standards. The most iconic version was long and pointed, resembling something you'd expect to see on a wizard or an elf working late shifts at Santa's workshop. These caps were usually made from wool, linen, or whatever warm fabric the family could spare without completely compromising their daytime clothing situation. For men, nightcaps were purely functional accessories. They pulled them on before bed, wrapped them around their heads, and tied them securely to prevent loss during sleep. The long, pointed design helped trap warm air around the head and neck, creating a kind of personal heating system for the most vulnerable part of the body. For women, nightcaps served double duty. Beyond warmth, they also maintained modesty and cleanliness. Medieval society expected married women to cover their hair at all times, even while sleeping. This wasn't just social convention, it was religious doctrine. A woman's hair was considered potentially seductive and therefore dangerous. Covering it, even in sleep, was seen as a moral obligation. Women's nightcaps sometimes doubled as coifs or head wraps that served multiple purposes. They kept hair clean and contained, which was important because washing hair was difficult, time-consuming, and potentially dangerous in medieval conditions. They also provided a barrier against the lice and other insects that were constant problems in medieval sleeping arrangements. But nightcaps weren't just about warmth and modesty. They also carried social significance. The quality, decoration, and style of a nightcap could indicate a person's wealth and status. Wealthy families might have nightcaps made from fine linen or even silk, possibly decorated with embroidery or trim. Poor families made do with rough wool or whatever fabric scraps they could piece together. In more urban areas, nightcaps became symbols of being off-duty. If someone opened their door wearing a nightcap, it was a polite medieval way of saying, "I'm not dressed for conversation, and this ridiculous hat should make that obvious." It was the medieval equivalent of answering the door in pajamas. Nightcaps were often paired with nightshirts, which were essentially long, loose tunics designed for sleeping. These weren't the comfortable pajamas we know today. They were rough, scratchy garments that provided warmth and coverage, while allowing for some freedom of movement during sleep. Picture this. A typical medieval person preparing for bed would put on a long, scratchy nightshirt that reached nearly to their knees, then pull on a pointed woolen cap that tied under their chin. They'd climb into their straw-filled mattress, pull a coarse wool blanket over themselves, and try to get comfortable while wearing what amounted to a medieval sleeping costume. The nightcap tradition was so embedded in medieval culture that it persisted long after heating improvements made them less necessary. Even wealthy people who could afford better heated homes continued wearing nightcaps out of habit and tradition. The image of someone sleeping in a long, pointed cap became so associated with bedtime that it appeared in countless medieval illustrations and manuscripts. Regional variations existed throughout medieval Europe. French nightcaps might be more elaborate, with longer points or decorative elements. German versions tended toward practical functionality. Italian styles sometimes incorporated local textile traditions. But everywhere, the basic concept remained the same. Keep your head warm or risk freezing to death in your sleep. Children wore miniature versions of adult nightcaps, often made from whatever fabric their parents could spare. These tiny caps were crucial for child survival because young bodies lost heat even faster than adults, and infant mortality rates were already devastatingly high without adding hypothermia to the list of threats. Medieval nightcaps also had to contend with the same pest problems that plagued all medieval clothing. Lice loved to nest in the warm, enclosed environment of a cloth cap. Fleas would jump from mattresses onto heads covered in fabric. The nightcaps themselves became breeding grounds for the same insects they were supposed to protect against. Cleaning nightcaps was problematic because washing any fabric item in medieval times was difficult and time-consuming. Most people owned only 1 or 2 nightcaps, and they might go months without washing them. This meant that the caps accumulated oils from hair, sweat from sleep, and various odors from the sleeping environment. Despite all these challenges, nightcaps remained essential items in medieval households. They were among the few pieces of specialized clothing that most people owned, and they were considered important enough to be mentioned in wills and inventories. A good nightcap was a valuable possession that could last for years and might be passed down through generations. The decline of nightcap wearing came gradually with improvements in home heating and bedding. As houses became better insulated and heating systems more effective, the critical need for head warming during sleep diminished. But the tradition persisted in some form well into the modern era, evolving into the sleeping caps that some people still wear today. Medieval nightcaps represent a perfect example of how medieval people adapted to the harsh realities of their world. They couldn't control the temperature of their homes or the quality of their beds, but they could put a ridiculous-looking woolen cap on their heads and slightly improve their chances of surviving the night. In a world where comfort was rare and survival was uncertain, even small improvements mattered enormously. In our modern world, sharing a bed with a stranger is generally limited to awkward situations like overnight flights, emergency shelter stays, or that one disastrous Airbnb booking where the photos were apparently taken with a very generous camera angle. But in medieval times, sleeping next to complete strangers was not only normal, it was expected, practical, and absolutely unavoidable. Let's set the scene. You're a traveling merchant in medieval Europe, or perhaps a pilgrim journeying to a shrine. Or maybe just someone whose mule died 3 villages back, and you need a place to sleep. You find an inn, which is already a stroke of incredible luck, because inns were rare and usually terrible. You approach the innkeeper and ask for a place to rest. What you get is not a private room with your own bed and a mint on your pillow. What you get is a spot in a bed that's already occupied by 2 or 3 other travelers, none of whom you've ever met, all of whom have been walking medieval roads for weeks without benefit of soap, deodorant, or regular clothing changes. Medieval inns operated more like human storage facilities than hotels. The goal was to pack as many paying customers as possible into the available sleeping space. Beds were expensive to maintain, rooms cost money to heat, and space was limited. Sharing beds wasn't just economical, it was the only way most inns could operate profitably. A typical inn bed might accommodate 2, 3, 4, or even more travelers, depending on the size of the bed and the flexibility of the customers. People would be arranged like sardines, lying side by side with strangers who might snore, talk in their sleep, have suspicious coughs, or possess personal hygiene standards that would make a medieval peasant cringe. The sleeping arrangements were usually segregated by gender, but not always. Some inns tried to separate men and women, but in crowded conditions, propriety sometimes gave way to practicality. Mixed-gender sleeping situations weren't unheard of, though they were generally avoided when possible to prevent both actual impropriety and accusations of impropriety. Some inns attempted to organize bed assignments by profession or social class. Blacksmiths might be grouped together, clergy with clergy, merchants with merchants. The theory was that people of similar backgrounds would be more compatible sleeping partners. In practice, this often meant that all the loudest snorers ended up in the same bed, or all the people with the worst personal hygiene were grouped together, creating concentrated pockets of misery. But professional segregation was a luxury that many inns couldn't afford. More often, beds were assigned on a first-come, first-served basis. The first person to claim a spot got the best position, usually against the wall where they were less likely to be pushed off during the night. Late arrivals had to squeeze into whatever space remained, often ending up precariously balanced on the edge of overcrowded mattresses. Privacy was not a concept that applied to medieval inn sleeping. There were no individual curtains around bed spaces, no personal storage areas, no way to separate yourself from your sleeping companions. You went to bed surrounded by strangers and woke up in the same intimate proximity, having shared not just sleeping space but also whatever sounds, smells, and movements occurred during the night. The sounds alone must have been extraordinary. Imagine a room filled with multiple beds, each occupied by several people, all with different sleeping patterns, medical conditions, and personal habits. Snoring would create a symphony of different tones and rhythms. People would talk in their sleep, sometimes in different languages. Coughing, wheezing, and various other bodily functions would provide constant background noise. Theft was a constant concern in these sleeping arrangements. Travelers carried their valuables with them because leaving possessions unguarded was essentially giving them away. Many people slept with their purses tied to their bodies or hidden under their clothing. Others used their personal belongings as pillows, turning luggage into both comfort items and security systems. Personal belongings might include money, important documents, tools of trade, weapons, extra clothing, food supplies, and religious items. All of these had to be protected while sleeping in close proximity to strangers who might be desperate, dishonest, or simply opportunistic. Some travelers slept on top of their possessions, literally using their bodies as security devices. The bed-sharing system created its own social etiquette and survival strategies. Experienced travelers learned to claim the best sleeping positions quickly, to sleep lightly enough to detect potential threats, and to secure their belongings effectively. They developed techniques for getting rest while remaining alert to dangers from both their sleeping companions and potential intruders. Regional variations existed in bed-sharing customs. In some areas, inns provided individual sleeping alcoves or partitioned spaces that offered slightly more privacy. Others operated dormitory-style halls with rows of shared beds and minimal privacy. The quality and organization of sleeping arrangements often reflected local customs, economic conditions, and the innkeeper's personal standards. Women traveling alone faced particular challenges in these sleeping arrangements. They were vulnerable to harassment, theft, and worse from both fellow travelers and inn staff. Some inns provided separate sleeping areas for women, but these were often the worst accommodations. Smaller spaces, older beds, less heat, and minimal security. Wealthy travelers could sometimes pay for better accommodations, but even the best medieval inns offered limited privacy and comfort. A wealthy person might get a bed shared with only one other person, instead of 3 or 4, or they might secure a position in a smaller room rather than a large dormitory hall. But truly, private accommodations were rare and expensive. The shared sleeping experience created temporary communities among travelers. People who slept next to each other might travel together the next day, share information about road conditions, or form alliances for mutual protection. These brief sleeping partnerships sometimes developed into longer travel arrangements or even business relationships. Disease transmission was a constant risk in shared sleeping situations. Respiratory illnesses, skin conditions, parasites, and various other ailments spread easily when people slept in close contact. Lice and fleas would migrate from person to person during the night, creating mobile infestations that traveled from inn to inn along trade routes. Some travelers tried to minimize health risks by bringing their own blankets or sleeping cloths, but most people had to use whatever bedding the inn provided. This meant sleeping under covers that had been used by countless previous guests and were rarely cleaned thoroughly between uses. The bed-sharing tradition extended beyond inns to private homes that took in travelers. Hospitality customs in many medieval societies obligated homeowners to provide shelter to strangers, but this usually meant sharing family sleeping spaces rather than providing separate accommodations. Children grew up accustomed to sharing beds with siblings, parents, extended family members, and occasionally strangers. Large families might have only one or two beds for the entire household, requiring careful organization and flexible sleeping arrangements. Children learned early to sleep deeply despite crowded conditions and to respect the limited personal space available to each person. The end of widespread bed sharing came gradually with economic development and changing social expectations. As inns became more prosperous and travelers more demanding, private rooms became more common. Improved construction techniques made it easier to build larger buildings with more individual spaces. Rising standards of personal privacy and hygiene made shared sleeping arrangements less socially acceptable. But for centuries, sleeping with strangers was simply part of medieval life. People accepted it as normal and necessary, developing strategies for safety, comfort, and rest within the constraints of their world. The practice shaped medieval travel culture, inn architecture, and social customs in ways that persisted long after individual sleeping arrangements became standard. In our modern world, bedtime routines might involve checking our phones one last time, maybe reading a few pages of a book, or listening to a calming podcast about serial killers or unsolved mysteries. But in medieval times, going to bed wasn't about relaxation or winding down. It was about preparing for the very real possibility that you might not wake up, and this required serious spiritual preparation. Medieval people didn't go to sleep thinking about what they'd have for breakfast or whether they'd remembered to feed the cat. They went to sleep wondering if they'd survive the night. And this wasn't paranoia. It was statistical reality. Death was a constant companion in medieval life, stalking through every day like an unwelcome dinner guest who never left. The medieval approach to bedtime was essentially a nightly negotiation with mortality. People understood that sleep was the closest thing to death that living people experienced regularly. You closed your eyes, lost consciousness, and surrendered control of your body and soul for hours at a time. In a world where death could come from disease, accident, violence, or simple bad luck, this daily surrender required spiritual protection. Enter bedtime prayers, which were far more complex and urgent than the simple, "Now I lay me down to sleep," that modern children might learn. Medieval bedtime prayers were comprehensive spiritual insurance policies designed to cover every possible threat that might arise during the vulnerable hours of sleep. The basic structure of medieval bedtime prayer involved several key components. First came confession and repentance for the day's sins, because dying with unconfessed sins on your soul was a one-way ticket to eternal damnation. Medieval people believed that any sin, no matter how minor, could trap your soul in purgatory or hell if you died without proper spiritual cleansing. This meant that every night, people would mentally review their entire day, searching for moments of anger, envy, pride, lust, gluttony, greed, or sloth. The 7 deadly sins that medieval Christianity taught were always lurking in human hearts. They'd remember harsh words spoken to neighbors, jealous thoughts about more prosperous families, moments of laziness during work, or any other moral failings that might have occurred. The confession process could be lengthy and detailed. Medieval people were taught to examine not just their actions, but their thoughts, intentions, and even their dreams from the previous night. If you dreamed about something sinful, that might be evidence of spiritual corruption that needed addressing before you risked sleep again. After confession came prayers for protection during the vulnerable hours ahead. Medieval people believed that sleep rendered the soul particularly susceptible to demonic influence, evil spirits, and various supernatural threats. While your body lay unconscious and defenseless, your soul needed divine protection to prevent corruption, possession, or theft. These protective prayers were specific and detailed. People would pray to their patron saints, asking for intercession against nightmares, evil spirits, sudden death, house fires, thieves, wild animals, and disease. They'd recite prayers they'd learned in childhood, often in Latin they didn't fully understand, but believed carried spiritual power through repetition and tradition. The prayer, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," might sound quaint to modern ears, but it was essentially a legal document acknowledging that death was a likely bedtime outcome. Medieval people understood that they could die from illness, accident, fire, violence, or simply the mysterious ways that people sometimes died in their sleep. The prayer was their attempt to ensure proper spiritual handling of their soul if the worst happened. Many adults maintained extensive personal prayer catalogs for different threats and occasions. They had specific prayers for when they felt particularly sinful, prayers for when plague was spreading through the community, prayers for when they suspected their neighbors might be practicing witchcraft, and prayers for when they'd eaten questionable food and worried about poisoning. Some people prayed to particular saints known for protecting sleepers and dreamers. Saint Michael the Archangel was popular for general protection against evil. Saint Christopher protected travelers, which included the spiritual journey through sleep. Saint Dymphna helped with mental disturbances that might manifest in nightmares or disturbed sleep. The really devout, particularly monks, nuns, and overly anxious nobles, ended their days with Compline, the final prayer service before sleep. After Compline, religious communities observed what was called the Great Silence, a period of complete quiet that lasted until morning prayers. This wasn't just about avoiding disturbance. It was about creating a spiritually pure environment for sleep. Compline prayers were designed to place the soul under divine protection for the night ahead. They included psalms asking for God's watchfulness over sleeping believers, prayers for peaceful rest free from disturbing dreams, and requests for protection against the terror that flies by night, a biblical reference that medieval people interpreted as literal demonic attacks on sleeping souls. Children were taught bedtime prayers almost as soon as they could speak. Parents would kneel beside crude beds or sleeping pallets, holding small hands while reciting prayers that asked for protection through the dangerous hours ahead. These weren't gentle, soothing bedtime rituals. They were urgent spiritual preparations for survival. Children's prayers often included requests for protection against specific childhood fears, monsters, evil spirits, wild animals, and the various supernatural threats that medieval folklore insisted were particularly drawn to young, innocent souls. Parents reminded their children that angels were watching over them, but this was less comforting reassurance and more like assigning celestial bodyguards to prevent spiritual kidnapping. Medieval people also believed that the manner of your death affected your eternal destination. Dying without proper spiritual preparation, without confession, without final prayers, without receiving last rites, could doom your soul regardless of how virtuously you'd lived. This made every sleep a gamble, because unexpected death during the night would leave no opportunity for final spiritual preparations. This fear led to the practice of what might be called preemptive last rites. People would go to bed each night spiritually prepared to die, having confessed their sins, made peace with their enemies, and placed their souls under divine protection. It was exhausting spiritual maintenance, but medieval people considered it essential insurance against eternal damnation. Some families incorporated group prayer into their bedtime routines. Before everyone settled into their shared sleeping spaces, the household would gather for collective prayers that asked for protection over the entire family, their animals, their property, and their community. These group sessions served multiple purposes: spiritual protection, family bonding, and social reinforcement of religious obligations. The prayers weren't just about death and damnation. They also addressed practical concerns. People prayed for protection against house fires, which were constant threats when homes were made of wood and thatch and heated by open flames. They prayed against thieves who might break in during the night. They asked for protection against wild animals that might wander too close to human habitations. Weather prayers were common during certain seasons. Winter bedtime prayers might ask for protection against freezing temperatures, while summer prayers focused on storms, floods, and lightning strikes. Spring prayers addressed concerns about crop failures and famine, while autumn prayers dealt with harvest anxieties and preparation for winter hardships. Disease prayers became particularly urgent during epidemic periods. When plague, cholera, or other infectious diseases spread through communities, bedtime prayers became desperate pleas for protection against contagion. People would pray not just for their own health, but for their families, their communities, and sometimes even their animals. Medieval bedtime prayers also reflected social and political anxieties. During periods of warfare, people prayed for protection against enemy armies, raiding parties, and various military threats. During times of social unrest, prayers addressed concerns about rebellion, violence, and civil disorder. The length and complexity of bedtime prayers could vary significantly based on personal circumstances, local conditions, and individual spiritual anxiety levels. During peaceful, prosperous times, prayers might be relatively brief and routine. During periods of crisis, danger, or spiritual distress, the prayer sessions could extend for extended periods as people desperately sought divine protection against multiplying threats. Some medieval people maintained written prayer books or collections of prayers for different situations. These weren't just spiritual resources. They were survival manuals that provided specific prayers for specific threats. A merchant might carry prayers for travel protection, while a farmer might focus on prayers related to agricultural concerns and seasonal dangers. The end result was that medieval bedtime wasn't a peaceful, relaxing transition to rest. It was a nightly confrontation with mortality that required serious spiritual preparation and constant vigilance against supernatural and natural threats. People went to sleep not expecting comfort and rejuvenation, but hoping simply to survive until morning with their souls intact. In our modern world, dreams are usually dismissed as random mental noise, stress processing, memory consolidation, or the brain's way of filing away the day's experiences. Maybe you had that dream about showing up to work naked because you're anxious about a presentation. Or perhaps you dreamed about your high school math teacher because your brain was randomly sorting through old memories. We understand dreams as psychological phenomena that don't necessarily mean anything significant. Medieval people had a completely different relationship with dreams. To them, dreams weren't just random brain activity. They were direct communications from the supernatural world. Every dream was a message, a warning, a prophecy, or an attack. Dreams came from God, from saints, from demons, from angels, or from your own soul traveling through spiritual realms while your body slept. This made sleep not just physically dangerous, but spiritually perilous. Medieval dream interpretation was serious business. Theologians, monks, scholars, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent enormous amounts of time and energy analyzing dreams and trying to decode their spiritual significance. Entire texts were devoted to understanding what different dream symbols meant and how to respond appropriately to dream messages. The basic medieval understanding was that during sleep, the soul became partially separated from the body, making it vulnerable to spiritual influences and capable of receiving supernatural communications. Your sleeping soul might travel to heaven and receive messages from saints, or it might be attacked by demons trying to corrupt your spiritual purity, or it might glimpse future events through divine revelation. This meant that every dream required careful analysis. Did you dream of fire? That might represent the fires of hell, divine purification, or a warning about literal fire threatening your home. Did you dream of water? That could symbolize baptismal purification, the tears of repentance, or the biblical floods that punished sinful humanity. Did you dream of animals? Each creature had specific spiritual significance that needed to be decoded. Religious dreams were particularly important and potentially dangerous. If you dreamed about saints, angels, or religious figures, this might be a genuine divine vision requiring immediate attention and possibly action. But it might also be a demonic deception designed to lead you into spiritual error. Distinguishing between genuine divine communications and demonic trickery required sophisticated theological knowledge and spiritual discernment. Monks and nuns were expected to report their dreams to spiritual superiors who would analyze them for religious significance. Some religious dreams were celebrated as evidence of divine favor and spiritual advancement. Others were treated as warnings about spiritual dangers or signs that the dreamer needed additional prayer, fasting, or penance. Medieval literature is filled with dream narratives where characters receive crucial information through sleep visions. Knights dreamed of quests they needed to undertake. Kings received warnings about threats to their kingdoms, and ordinary people learned about hidden sins or future disasters through dream revelations. These weren't considered fictional devices. They reflected genuine medieval beliefs about how divine communication operated. But dreams weren't just sources of divine messages. They were also battlegrounds where demons fought for human souls. Medieval people believed that evil spirits could enter dreams to tempt sleepers towards sin, corrupt their spiritual purity, or plant evil thoughts that would influence waking behavior. Sexual dreams were particularly problematic from a medieval Christian perspective. If you experienced sexual imagery in dreams, this might be evidence that demons were trying to corrupt your soul through lustful temptations. Alternatively, it might indicate that your own soul was spiritually impure and needed cleansing through prayer, fasting, and penance. The church taught that people were responsible for their dream content to some degree. While you couldn't completely control what you dreamed, your spiritual state, daily behaviors, and moral purity influenced the types of dreams you experienced. Virtuous people received divine dreams, while sinful people attracted demonic dream attacks. This created enormous anxiety around dream content. People worried not just about nightmares that disturbed their sleep, but about any dream that might indicate spiritual corruption or divine displeasure. A disturbing dream might be evidence that you needed to confess hidden sins, increase your prayer and fasting, or seek spiritual counsel from religious authorities. Medieval people developed various strategies for encouraging good dreams and preventing evil ones. Some slept with religious relics, holy water, or blessed objects near their beds, believing these would provide spiritual protection during sleep. Others recited specific prayers designed to ward off demonic dream attacks and invite divine dream messages. Dietary practices were thought to influence dream content. Certain foods were believed to encourage nightmares or evil dreams, while others promoted peaceful, spiritually beneficial sleep. Medieval medical texts provided detailed instructions about eating habits that would improve dream quality and spiritual safety during sleep. The timing of meals was also considered important. Eating too close to bedtime was thought to create physical and spiritual disturbances that made sleepers more vulnerable to demonic influences and less receptive to divine communications. This wasn't just about indigestion. It was about maintaining proper spiritual conditions for safe sleep. Nightmare interpretation was particularly complex because disturbing dreams might come from several different sources. They might be divine warnings about real dangers, demonic attacks designed to cause spiritual or psychological harm, or natural results of physical illness, dietary problems, or emotional distress. Distinguishing between these different types of nightmares required careful analysis of dream content, the dreamer's spiritual state, recent behaviors, and current life circumstances. Religious authorities developed elaborate systems for categorizing different types of disturbing dreams and prescribing appropriate responses to each category. Some nightmares were treated as calls to spiritual action. A dream about death might be a divine warning to prepare spiritually for your own mortality or the death of someone close to you. A dream about violence might indicate that you needed to reconcile with enemies or address anger and hatred in your spiritual life. Other nightmares were understood as spiritual attacks that required defensive responses. Demonic dream attacks might be countered through increased prayer, religious rituals, blessing of sleeping spaces, or consultation with spiritual authorities who could provide stronger protection against supernatural assault. Medieval people also believed that dreams could provide practical information about waking life. Prophetic dreams might warn about coming disasters, reveal hidden information about other people's intentions, or provide guidance about important decisions. This made dream interpretation not just spiritually important, but practically useful. Professional dream interpreters existed in some medieval communities, offering services similar to fortune tellers or counselors. These individuals claimed special knowledge about dream symbolism and spiritual communication, helping others understand their dream messages and respond appropriately to supernatural communications received during sleep. The social implications of dream sharing were significant. Telling others about your dreams could enhance your reputation if they were interpreted as evidence of divine favor or spiritual advancement. But sharing dreams could also be dangerous if they were interpreted as evidence of spiritual corruption, demonic influence, or heretical beliefs. Some dreams were considered so spiritually significant that they influenced major life decisions. Medieval chronicles describe people who changed careers, entered religious life, went on pilgrimages, or made other major life changes based on dream revelations. These weren't considered irrational decisions. They were understood as appropriate responses to divine communications. The medieval approach to dreams created a complex psychological landscape where sleep became a form of spiritual adventure and potential danger. People went to bed knowing that their dreams might contain crucial information about their spiritual state, their future, or their relationship with the divine. This added another layer of anxiety and responsibility to the already challenging medieval sleep experience. In our modern world, sleeping with pets is a lifestyle choice that usually involves cute Instagram photos and debates about whether dogs should be allowed on expensive mattresses. Some people love having their furry friends curled up beside them, while others prefer their beds to be pet-free zones. But in medieval times, sharing your sleeping space with animals wasn't a choice. It was a survival strategy, and the animals involved weren't necessarily adorable house pets. Medieval homes were not the climate-controlled environments we're accustomed to. They were essentially elaborate sheds with pretensions, offering minimal protection against cold, dampness, and the general hostility of medieval weather. Stone walls conducted cold like they were designed for refrigeration. Wooden structures had gaps that whistled with drafts. Thatched roofs leaked air, water, and occasionally the small creatures that lived in them. Central heating was a concept that wouldn't exist for centuries. The closest thing to temperature control was a fire in the main room, and even that was often allowed to die down at night to conserve precious fuel. Bedrooms, when they existed as separate spaces, were cold chambers where your breath formed visible clouds and frost might develop on the walls during winter nights. In these brutal conditions, sharing body heat with animals wasn't eccentric. It was essential. Animals generated warmth continuously. They were available and willing heating partners, and unlike some human companions, they didn't complain about sleeping arrangements or steal blankets during the night. Let's start with the most obvious animal companions: dogs. Medieval families often kept dogs for protection, hunting, and companionship, and these dogs frequently shared sleeping spaces with their human families. A large dog curled up against your back or legs could provide significant warmth during cold nights, functioning as a living, breathing heating pad that lasted all night. Medieval dogs weren't the pampered, regularly bathed pets we know today. They were working animals that spent their days outdoors, rolling in dirt, hunting vermin, and engaging in various activities that would horrify modern pet owners. They brought their own collection of fleas, ticks, and other parasites to the sleeping arrangements, adding to the already impressive insect populations that inhabited medieval bedding. But dogs were just the beginning. Peasant families frequently shared their sleeping spaces with chickens, which might seem bizarre until you consider the practical advantages. Chickens were valuable assets that needed protection from predators like foxes, weasels, and thieves. Bringing them indoors at night kept them safe while providing additional warmth for human sleepers. Chickens would roost in corners of the main room, sometimes on improvised perches or platforms, sometimes simply finding comfortable spots on or near the family's sleeping area. They generated modest amounts of body heat, and their soft clucking and occasional fluttering provided familiar background noise that many medieval people found comforting. The downside, of course, was that chickens are not particularly house-trained animals. They would defecate wherever they happened to be, including on or near sleeping humans. Medieval people simply accepted this as part of the arrangement, cleaning up chicken droppings in the morning along with all the other unpleasant maintenance tasks that medieval life required. Pigs were another common sleeping companion in peasant households. Medieval pigs were smaller and more manageable than modern farm pigs, but they were still substantial animals that generated significant body heat. A pig sleeping near the family's bed could raise the ambient temperature noticeably, which was crucial for survival during harsh winters. Pigs were also valuable animals that needed protection from theft and predators. Like chickens, they were often brought indoors at night for security reasons. Unlike chickens, pigs were large enough to serve as effective heating systems for entire families. The obvious problem with pigs was that they were pigs. They were not clean animals by any reasonable standard. They made noise, they smelled distinctively, and they produced substantial amounts of waste. But medieval people prioritized warmth and security over cleanliness and comfort, so pig roommates were accepted as reasonable arrangements. Some families shared sleeping spaces with goats, which offered many of the same advantages as pigs, but with different challenges. Goats generated warmth, needed protection from predators, and were valuable enough to justify bringing indoors. However, goats were more active and curious than pigs, more likely to wander around during the night, and capable of climbing onto sleeping surfaces where they might not be welcome. Cats were present in some medieval households, primarily for pest control rather than companionship. Medieval homes were infested with rats and mice that contaminated food supplies and damaged stored goods. Cats helped control these rodent populations, and they occasionally served as sleeping companions for humans who didn't mind sharing their beds with semi-wild predators. Medieval cats were not the domesticated, predictable pets we know today. They were working animals with strong hunting instincts, territorial behaviors, and independent personalities. A cat might curl up with humans one night and disappear for several days the next, following its own agenda regardless of human preferences. The arrangement of animals and humans in medieval sleeping spaces required careful consideration and management. Animals needed to be positioned where they could provide warmth without interfering with human sleep comfort. They needed access to water and food during long winter nights. They needed to be secured so they wouldn't wander off or be stolen while everyone slept. Some families constructed crude partitions or barriers to separate different types of animals and prevent conflicts during the night. Chickens might be kept in one area, pigs in another, with dogs free to move between spaces. These arrangements required constant adjustment based on animal behavior, weather conditions, and family needs. The animal sleeping arrangements also required consideration of safety and health risks. Large animals like pigs could accidentally injure sleeping humans by rolling over or stepping on them. All animals carried parasites and diseases that could be transmitted to humans. Animal waste created sanitation problems that increased disease risk and made sleeping areas unpleasant. Medieval people developed various strategies for managing these animal relationships. They learned to sleep lightly enough to avoid being injured by moving animals. They positioned themselves carefully to maximize warmth benefits, while minimizing exposure to animal waste and aggressive behavior. They created routines for managing animal needs during the night without disrupting human sleep schedules. The social aspects of animal bed sharing were also significant. Wealthy families who could afford better heating and security didn't usually share their sleeping spaces with livestock. Having animals in your bedroom was a sign of poverty and low social status. Nobles might keep small lapdogs or hunting hounds in their chambers, but they didn't sleep with pigs and chickens. This created interesting social dynamics around animal sleeping arrangements. Peasant families might be embarrassed about their livestock sleeping companions when interacting with higher status individuals. Travelers staying in peasant homes might be shocked by sleeping arrangements that included multiple animal species. Religious attitudes toward animal sleeping companions were complex. Some religious authorities viewed the practice as evidence of moral degradation or inappropriate intimacy between humans and beasts. Others recognized it as practical necessity for poor families trying to survive harsh conditions. The decline of animal bed sharing came gradually with improvements in home heating and construction. As houses became better insulated and heating systems more effective, the critical need for animal warmth diminished. As economic conditions improved, families could afford separate shelters for their animals and better bedding for themselves. But for centuries, millions of medieval people shared their sleeping spaces with various animal species, creating complex household ecosystems where humans and animals coexisted in intimate proximity. These arrangements were practical solutions to the harsh realities of medieval life, even if they created their own challenges and complications. The practice reflects the fundamental difference between medieval and modern approaches to comfort, cleanliness, and personal space. Medieval people prioritized survival over aesthetics, warmth over cleanliness, and practical benefits over social conventions. In their world, a pig in the bedroom was not a problem to be solved, but a resource to be managed. If you think medieval peasant sleep was challenging, wait until you hear about monastic sleep. Medieval monasteries took the already bizarre practice of segmented sleep and turned it into a form of spiritual athletics that would make modern sleep deprivation researchers weep with professional horror. Monastic communities didn't just accept the natural two-sleep cycle that characterized medieval rest. They weaponized it for spiritual purposes, creating sleep schedules so demanding and interrupted that they bordered on systematic torture disguised as religious devotion. Let's start with the basic structure of monastic sleep, which was governed by something called the canonical hours. These were specific times throughout the day and night when monks were required to gather for prayer services, regardless of their personal sleep needs, energy levels, or desire to remain unconscious. The canonical hours divided the full day into 8 prayer periods, and several of these occurred during what normal people would consider prime sleeping time. The most notorious was matins, which was scheduled for the middle of the night, typically around 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., right in the heart of when even medieval people expected to be unconscious. Picture this. You're a monk in a medieval monastery. You've gone to bed after Compline, the final prayer service of the evening, probably around 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. You've managed to fall asleep in your rough wool habit on a wooden plank with minimal padding, surrounded by dozens of other monks in a cold, drafty dormitory. You're deep in first sleep when suddenly, bells start ringing. These aren't gentle, melodious chimes designed to ease you into wakefulness. These are loud, insistent bells specifically intended to wake up everyone in the monastery immediately. There's no snooze button, no gradual awakening, no time to lie in bed gathering your thoughts. The bells ring, and you get up. Immediately. Within minutes of the bells, dozens of monks would be stumbling out of their beds, pulling on sandals in the darkness, and shuffling through cold stone corridors toward the chapel. There was no time to fully wake up, no opportunity to prepare mentally for the upcoming service. You went from deep sleep to active participation in religious ritual in a matter of minutes. The matin service could last anywhere from 1 to 2 hours depending on the specific religious order and the liturgical calendar. During this time, monks would stand in unheated stone chapels chanting Latin prayers and psalms while their bodies struggled to maintain alertness and warmth. The services were conducted by candlelight, which provided minimal illumination and no heat. After matins ended, monks would return to their dormitories for what was essentially second sleep. But this wasn't necessarily a comfortable return to rest. The interruption had been significant, long enough and stimulating enough that many monks had difficulty falling back asleep immediately. They might lie awake for extended periods before achieving second sleep, reducing their total rest time even further. But matins wasn't the only middle-of-the-night disruption. Some monastic orders included additional nighttime services or extended matins into multiple parts with brief intervals between them. The most extreme communities might have monks awake for several hours during the middle of the night, turning the canonical sleep period into a complex sequence of brief sleep periods punctuated by religious obligations. The monastic dormitory itself was designed to discourage comfort and promote spiritual discipline. Monks typically slept in large, common rooms filled with individual beds or sleeping spaces. Privacy was minimal, comfort was actively discouraged, and heating was often non-existent. Individual sleeping spaces consisted of simple wooden platforms, sometimes with thin straw mattresses, but often with nothing more than rough blankets placed directly on wooden boards. Pillows were considered luxuries that interfered with spiritual discipline. Some monasteries provided hard blocks of wood for head support, while others expected monks to sleep without any head elevation at all. Monks slept fully clothed in their religious habits. This wasn't just about modesty or convenience. It was about spiritual readiness. They were supposed to be prepared to rise immediately for prayer services without taking time to dress. Sleeping naked or in specialized sleeping garments was considered spiritually inappropriate and practically impractical. The clothing itself was uncomfortable for sleeping. Monastic habits were made from rough, scratchy wool that chafed against skin during movement. The robes were designed for durability and humility, not comfort. Sleeping in these garments meant accepting chronic discomfort as part of spiritual discipline. Silence was enforced in monastic dormitories with strictness that would impress modern military drill sergeants. Monks were forbidden to speak during sleep hours except in genuine emergencies. Snoring, talking in sleep, or other nocturnal sounds that disturbed fellow monks could result in disciplinary action. The silence rule extended to movement and other activities. Monks were expected to move quietly, avoid unnecessary sounds, and minimize disruption to others' sleep. This created an atmosphere of enforced quiet that some found peaceful, but others experienced as oppressive and anxiety-inducing. Some monastic orders took sleep deprivation to even more extreme levels. Certain communities practiced deliberate sleep restriction as a form of spiritual discipline, believing that excessive sleep indicated laziness, self-indulgence, or insufficient dedication to religious life. These extreme orders might reduce sleep time below what was necessary for basic health, expecting monks to function on 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night, while maintaining full schedules of prayer, work, study, and religious services. Monks who struggled with these schedules were often viewed as spiritually weak rather than physically exhausted. The most fanatical communities sometimes encouraged monks to sleep sitting upright or in other uncomfortable positions that prevented deep, restorative sleep. The theory was that comfortable sleep led to spiritual complacency, while uncomfortable sleep maintained proper focus on spiritual rather than physical concerns. Individual monks who showed signs of sleep deprivation, difficulty concentrating during prayers, falling asleep during services, or reduced work capacity, were often assigned additional spiritual exercises rather than additional rest. The assumption was that these problems indicated spiritual rather than physical deficiencies. Some monastic orders included special sleep-related penances for monks who were perceived as too fond of sleep or rest. These might include sleeping on particularly uncomfortable surfaces, reducing sleep time further, or performing additional nighttime prayer vigils that eliminated sleep entirely for extended periods. The health consequences of monastic sleep schedules were significant and largely ignored. Chronic sleep deprivation affected immune function, cognitive performance, emotional regulation, and physical health. Many monks developed chronic fatigue, depression, anxiety, and various physical ailments that were directly related to inadequate rest. But these health problems were often interpreted through spiritual rather than medical frameworks. A monk who became ill from sleep deprivation might be seen as being tested by God, purified through suffering, or revealing hidden spiritual weaknesses that required additional discipline. Some monastic communities developed reputations for producing saints and visionaries, but many of these religious experiences might have been related to sleep deprivation-induced hallucinations, altered mental states, or psychological symptoms of chronic exhaustion rather than genuine divine revelations. The social dynamics within monastic dormitories were complex and sometimes problematic. Monks who adapted well to the demanding sleep schedule might look down on those who struggled. Those who had difficulty with nighttime services might face social pressure, spiritual counseling, or disciplinary action from religious superiors. Age differences created additional complications. Older monks often had more difficulty with frequent sleep interruptions, while younger monks might adapt more easily to the demanding schedules. However, monastic communities typically expected all members to maintain the same sleep schedule regardless of age or physical capacity. The monastic approach to sleep reflected broader medieval attitudes toward physical comfort, spiritual discipline, and the relationship between body and soul. Sleep was viewed not as necessary rest and recovery, but as a potential spiritual danger that needed to be carefully managed and frequently interrupted to prevent excessive attachment to physical pleasure. This attitude toward sleep persisted in some monastic communities well into the modern era, though most religious orders eventually modified their schedules to allow for more adequate rest. The extreme sleep deprivation practices of medieval monasteries remain as historical examples of how religious ideology could override basic human physiological needs. The monastic sleep experience represents one of the most systematically demanding approaches to rest in human history, turning the natural challenge of medieval sleep into an even more complex spiritual and physical endurance test that few modern people could survive for extended periods. When we talk about medieval sleep, we can't ignore the fundamental reality that shaped every aspect of how people rested: the absolute impenetrable darkness that engulfed their world every single night. Modern people have no concept of true darkness because we live in a world of electric lights, street lamps, car headlights, and the constant glow of electronic devices. Even our dark nights are filled with artificial light pollution that makes true blackness almost impossible to experience. Medieval people lived in a world where sunset meant the beginning of a darkness so complete and terrifying that it fundamentally altered human behavior, social organization, and psychological well-being. When the sun went down, which could be as early as 4 p.m. during winter months, the world didn't just become dim, It became a hostile, alien environment where familiar spaces turned dangerous and navigation became nearly impossible. The only sources of light available to medieval people were fire-based, candles, oil lamps, torches, and the occasional bonfire. These weren't the convenient, reliable light sources we might imagine. They were expensive, dangerous, smoky, and provided illumination that was weak, flickering, and limited in range. Candles were luxury items that most people couldn't afford to use casually. They were made from animal fat, tallow, or beeswax, both of which were valuable commodities. Tallow candles smelled terrible when burning and produced thick, acrid smoke that filled enclosed spaces with nauseating fumes. Beeswax candles smelled better but were prohibitively expensive for most people. A single candle might provide enough light to read by if you held the book very close and the wick was fresh, but the illumination didn't extend much beyond a few feet. Multiple candles could light a small room moderately well, but the cost of burning several candles for an entire evening would be equivalent to a significant portion of a family's weekly income. Oil lamps were slightly more economical, but came with their own problems. The oil was usually derived from animal fat or plant sources, both expensive and sometimes rancid. The lamps smoked constantly, required frequent refilling, and produced a flame that was even more flickering and unreliable than candles. Torches provided more light, but were extremely dangerous in homes made of wood, thatch, and other flammable materials. They also burned out quickly and required constant replacement. Most people used torches only for essential outdoor activities like tending animals or responding to emergencies. This meant that for practical purposes, most medieval people lived by a schedule that was entirely determined by natural light. When the sun set, productive activities essentially stopped. There was no evening entertainment, no nighttime socializing, no after-dark work or study. People went to bed shortly after sunset not because they were tired, but because there was literally nothing else they could reasonably do. The psychological impact of this darkness was enormous. Modern people who have never experienced true darkness often underestimate how disorienting and frightening it can be. In complete darkness, familiar spaces become alien landscapes. A room you know perfectly well in daylight becomes a maze of obstacles and potential dangers when you can't see your own hand in front of your face. Medieval people developed various strategies for navigating in darkness, but these were limited and risky. They might feel along walls, follow familiar paths by memory, or use the weak light from dying fires to provide minimal guidance. But any movement in complete darkness carried the risk of injury from furniture, stairs, holes in floors, or other hazards. The darkness also created security problems that modern people rarely consider. In a world without streetlights or reliable indoor lighting, it was incredibly easy for criminals, thieves, or enemies to approach buildings undetected. People couldn't see threats coming until they were essentially on top of them. This led to various defensive strategies around nighttime security. Dogs were valuable, not just as companions, but as early warning systems that could detect intruders by sound or smell when human senses were useless. Families might designate someone to remain partially alert during the night, listening for suspicious sounds or movements. The darkness also influenced the timing and nature of criminal activity. Theft, violence, and other crimes were often planned around the cover of darkness when visibility was minimal and escape was easier. This created a cycle where nighttime became associated with danger and threat, making sleep even more psychologically challenging. Weather made the darkness even more problematic. On cloudy nights, when moon and starlight were blocked, the blackness was so complete that people might become disoriented even in familiar locations. Rain or snow reduced visibility further and made any nighttime movement extremely hazardous. Seasonal variations in daylight hours had profound effects on medieval life patterns. During summer months, when daylight lasted until late evening, people could extend their active hours and maintain more normal sleep schedules. But during winter, when darkness fell in mid-afternoon and lasted until late morning, the forced confinement to dark spaces created problems ranging from depression to cabin fever. The darkness affected social relationships and family dynamics in ways that modern people might not consider. Families were forced into close proximity for extended periods when outdoor activities became impossible. Privacy was already limited in medieval homes, but darkness eliminated even the possibility of finding separate spaces for individual activities. Children were particularly affected by the extensive darkness. Modern children who are afraid of the dark can usually find comfort in night lights, hallway lighting, or electronic devices. Medieval children had to cope with darkness so complete that they couldn't see anything beyond their immediate sleeping area, and even that only if a fire was still burning nearby. The darkness also influenced religious and spiritual beliefs in significant ways. Night became associated with evil, danger, and supernatural threats. Biblical references to the terror that flies by night resonated powerfully with people who genuinely feared what might be lurking in the impenetrable blackness surrounding their homes. Many medieval folklore traditions reflect the reality of living in complete darkness. Stories about creatures that only came out at night, about the dangers of venturing outside after sunset, and about the protective power of light and fire all reflected genuine fears and practical concerns about navigating a world without artificial illumination. The morning sunrise had a psychological and practical significance that modern people can barely imagine. The return of light meant the return of safety, productivity, and normal social interaction. People greeted dawn not just as the beginning of a new day, but as deliverance from the isolation and vulnerability of darkness. This daily cycle of light and darkness created a rhythm of life that was fundamentally different from anything we experience today. People lived in constant awareness of the sun's position and the approaching night. Activities were planned around maximizing productive use of daylight hours. Social gatherings, work schedules, and even meals were timed to avoid the limitations imposed by darkness. The economic implications of this light dependency were significant. Industries that required good visibility, textile work, metalworking, scholarly activities, artistic pursuits, were severely limited by available daylight hours. This affected productivity, economic development, and the accumulation of knowledge in ways that rippled through medieval society. The transition to artificial lighting came gradually and unevenly. Wealthy urban centers might have some street lighting or public torches, but these were rare exceptions rather than normal infrastructure. Most people continued to live by natural light cycles well into the modern era, making the medieval experience of darkness a reality for the vast majority of human history. Understanding this darkness is crucial to understanding medieval sleep patterns because the absolute blackness that surrounded people every night wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a fundamental force that shaped their daily lives, their sleep schedules, their social relationships, and their understanding of safety and security in the world. While we've been exploring the strange world of medieval sleep customs, it's important to remember that not everyone adapted successfully to these bizarre arrangements. Medieval people suffered from insomnia, sleep disorders, and various nighttime ailments just like modern people do, except they had to deal with them without sleep studies, prescription medications, or any real understanding of what was happening to their bodies and minds. Medieval insomnia was a well-documented problem that affected people across all social classes. Chronicle accounts, medical texts, and personal writings from the period describe countless individuals who struggled with sleeplessness, restless nights, and the daytime exhaustion that followed. But the medieval understanding of sleep disorders was filtered through religious, medical, and cultural frameworks that would seem bizarre to modern sleep specialists. The most common explanation for persistent sleeplessness was spiritual in nature. Medieval people often interpreted insomnia as a sign of divine displeasure, unconfessed sin, or demonic interference. If you couldn't sleep, it might mean that God was trying to communicate with you, that your soul was troubled by hidden guilt, or that evil spirits were preventing your natural rest as part of some supernatural assault. This spiritual interpretation led to treatments that focused on prayer, confession, penance, and various religious remedies rather than addressing potential physical or psychological causes. Insomniacs might be advised to increase their prayer time, fast more rigorously, confess more thoroughly, or perform additional acts of religious devotion to restore divine favor and natural sleep patterns. Medieval medical theory also provided explanations for sleep disorders, though these were based on the humoral system that dominated medieval understanding of health and disease. According to this framework, sleeplessness resulted from imbalances between the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Different types of insomnia were attributed to different humoral imbalances. Restless, agitated sleeplessness might be caused by excess yellow bile, choler, creating a hot, dry condition that prevented peaceful rest. Melancholic insomnia, characterized by sadness and worry, was attributed to excess black bile. Sleeplessness accompanied by physical restlessness might indicate too much blood, while sluggish wakefulness could suggest excess phlegm. The treatments derived from humoral theory were often more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting was a common remedy for sleep disorders attributed to excess blood, involving the deliberate removal of blood through cutting, leeching, or cupping. Patients who were already exhausted from sleeplessness would be further weakened by having their blood drained, often making their sleep problems worse rather than better. Purging was another standard treatment, involving the use of laxatives, emetics, or other substances designed to expel excess humors from the body. Sleep-deprived patients might be given powerful purgatives that caused violent diarrhea or vomiting, based on the theory that eliminating corrupted humors would restore natural sleep patterns. Herbal remedies were widely used for sleep disorders, and some of these were actually effective, though often dangerous. Poppy preparations containing natural opiates could induce sleep, but carried risks of overdose, addiction, and other complications. Mandragora, mandrake, was used as a sleep aid but was highly toxic and could easily cause poisoning or death. Other herbal treatments included preparations made from lettuce seeds, which were believed to have sedative properties, and various aromatic herbs like lavender, chamomile, and valerian that were burned or placed near sleeping areas. Some of these gentler remedies may have provided mild benefits without serious side effects. Dietary approaches to treating insomnia were based on medieval understanding of how different foods affected the humoral balance. Patients might be advised to avoid hot foods that could increase yellow bile, or to consume more cool foods to counteract excessive heat in their bodily systems. The foods considered problematic for sleep included spices, alcohol, red meat, and other items thought to generate internal heat and agitation. Recommended sleep-promoting foods might include lettuce, milk, certain fish, and various preparations thought to have cooling or calming effects on the body's humoral balance. But medieval sleep disorders weren't limited to simple insomnia. Period sources describe conditions that modern medicine would recognize as sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, night terrors, and various other sleep-related problems. However, these were interpreted through medieval frameworks that often missed their true nature. Sleep apnea, which causes people to stop breathing repeatedly during sleep, was sometimes described in medieval texts, but was usually attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment, rather than physical obstructions in the airway. People who snored loudly or seemed to struggle for breath during sleep might be subjected to exorcism rituals rather than medical treatment. Night terrors and nightmares were particularly problematic in medieval contexts because they were often interpreted as spiritual attacks or prophetic visions rather than sleep disorders. People who experienced vivid, frightening dreams might be considered blessed with divine visions, cursed with demonic communications, or afflicted with spiritual conditions that required religious rather than medical intervention. Sleepwalking presented special challenges in medieval communities because it was often viewed as evidence of supernatural influence. People who wandered around at night while unconscious were sometimes thought to be possessed, bewitched, or receiving divine communications that compelled them to move without conscious awareness. The treatments for sleepwalking ranged from the practical to the bizarre. Some families simply tied sleepwalkers to their beds to prevent nighttime wandering. Others tried various protective charms, religious rituals, or exorcism procedures to address what they perceived as supernatural causes. Medieval children who experienced sleep disorders faced particular challenges because childhood sleep problems were often attributed to moral failings, spiritual weaknesses, or demonic influences. A child who couldn't sleep might be seen as particularly susceptible to evil influences or lacking in spiritual discipline despite their young age. The social implications of sleep disorders in medieval communities were significant. People who suffered from chronic insomnia, loud snoring, or disruptive sleep behaviors might face social isolation, suspicion, or accusations of spiritual corruption. In communities where shared sleeping arrangements were common, disruptive sleep disorders affected not just the sufferer, but everyone in their sleeping area. Some sleep disorders were actually made worse by medieval sleeping conditions. The shared beds, poor air quality, uncomfortable mattresses, and temperature extremes that characterized medieval sleep environments could exacerbate existing sleep problems or create new ones. The segmented sleep schedule that was normal in medieval times might have been particularly difficult for people with certain sleep disorders. Individuals who had trouble falling asleep initially might find it even more challenging to return to sleep after the required midnight awakening period. Medieval monasteries, with their extremely demanding sleep schedules and frequent nighttime disruptions, probably created sleep disorders in otherwise healthy individuals, while making existing sleep problems much worse. The chronic sleep deprivation that was considered spiritually beneficial in monastic communities would have had serious health consequences that were rarely recognized or addressed. Despite these challenges, some medieval people found ways to cope with their sleep disorders using practical strategies that were surprisingly modern in their approach. They might adjust their sleeping positions, modify their diet, create more comfortable sleeping environments within the constraints of their circumstances, or develop personal routines that help them manage their sleep difficulties. The medieval experience of sleep disorders reminds us that these problems have plagued humanity throughout history, even though the understanding and treatment of such conditions has evolved dramatically. Medieval people who couldn't sleep faced not only the physical and psychological consequences of sleep deprivation, but also the additional burden of social and spiritual interpretations that often made their suffering worse rather than better. We've covered the sleep challenges faced by peasants, monks, and ordinary medieval people. But there was one group whose sleeping arrangements were so bizarre and uncomfortable that they deserve special attention: knights and soldiers who sometimes had to sleep while wearing armor. This wasn't a regular occurrence, but during military campaigns, sieges, and other dangerous situations, medieval warriors faced the challenge of getting rest while wearing up to 60 pounds of metal protection. Let's be clear about something first. Most knights and soldiers didn't regularly sleep in full armor. Under normal circumstances, they would remove their metal protection for sleep, just like anyone else would take off uncomfortable work clothes at the end of the day. Armor was hot, heavy, restrictive, and made normal sleep positions nearly impossible. Only extreme circumstances forced people to sleep while armored. But those extreme circumstances occurred frequently enough that sleeping in armor became a recognized part of medieval military life. During active campaigns in enemy territory, knights might sleep in partial or full armor to be ready for surprise attacks. During sieges, defenders might remain armored for days or weeks at a time. In hostile environments where immediate combat readiness was essential for survival, warriors had to find ways to get rest while maintaining their protection. The physical challenges of sleeping in armor were enormous. Chainmail, which was common throughout much of the medieval period, consisted of thousands of interlocking metal rings that created a flexible but heavy protective garment. A full suit of mail could weigh 30 to 50 pounds, distributed across the entire body, but concentrated on the shoulders and torso. Sleeping in chainmail meant dealing with the constant weight pressing down on your body, the metal rings pressing into your flesh at pressure points, and the way the mail shifted and bunched up when you tried to lie down. The rings would pinch skin, catch on bedding, and create uncomfortable pressure spots that made sleep nearly impossible. Later medieval plate armor presented different but equally challenging problems for sleep. While plate armor distributed weight more evenly than mail, it was rigid and restrictive, making it difficult to find comfortable sleeping positions. The joints and connections between plates would dig into flesh, and the overall inflexibility of the armor made normal sleep movements impossible. Knights sleeping in armor had to learn specialized sleeping positions and techniques. Many slept sitting up or propped against walls, trees, or other supports because lying flat was too uncomfortable or impossible in rigid armor. Others learned to sleep on their sides in carefully arranged positions that minimized pressure points and allowed for some rest despite the metal constraints. The psychological challenges were almost as significant as the physical ones. Sleeping while wearing armor required maintaining a state of partial alertness because you needed to be ready for immediate action if attacked. This hypervigilant state was incompatible with deep, restorative sleep, meaning that armored sleepers often woke up exhausted despite having rested for several hours. Medieval military manuals and chronicles describe various strategies that warriors used to make armored sleep more bearable. Some would remove just their helmets and gauntlets, keeping the rest of their armor on while allowing their heads and hands some relief. Others might loosen or partially remove pieces that weren't absolutely essential for immediate protection. The concept of sleeping in shifts became particularly important for armored soldiers. Groups of knights might organize watch schedules where some members remained fully alert and armored, while others were allowed to remove some pieces and get better rest. This system provided security while allowing for some recovery of sleep-deprived warriors. Squires and other support personnel played crucial roles in managing armored sleep arrangements. They might help adjust armor for better sleeping positions, provide additional padding or support, or assist with partial removal and replacement of armor pieces during rest periods. The padding worn under armor, called gambeson or acketon, was designed primarily for protection during combat, but also served important functions during sleep. These thick, quilted garments provided some cushioning between metal armor and flesh, reducing pressure points and making sleep slightly more comfortable. However, the padding also created its own problems for sleeping. Gambesons were thick, hot, and often became soaked with sweat during extended wear. Sleeping in sweat-soaked padding while wearing metal armor created uncomfortable, unhygienic conditions that could lead to skin problems, infections, and other health issues. Medieval siege warfare created some of the most challenging armored sleeping situations. During extended sieges that might last weeks or months, defenders might remain partially or fully armored for long periods, sleeping in shifts while maintaining constant readiness for assault. The psychological stress of siege conditions, combined with the physical discomfort of armored sleep and the constant threat of attack, created extreme sleep deprivation that affected decision-making, reaction times, and overall military effectiveness. Historical accounts describe siege defenders becoming increasingly irrational and prone to errors as prolonged sleep deprivation took its toll. Crusading armies faced particular challenges with armored sleep because they were operating in unfamiliar territories, often with limited supplies and support. Knights on crusade might sleep in armor for weeks at a time while traveling through hostile regions or during extended military campaigns. The climate conditions encountered during crusades made armored sleep even more challenging. Hot desert environments turned metal armor into ovens that made sleep nearly impossible, while cold, wet conditions created different but equally uncomfortable sleeping situations for armored warriors. Weather considerations significantly affected armored sleep strategies. Rain could make armor slippery and uncomfortable, while also soaking through padding and creating rust problems. Cold weather made metal armor painfully cold to wear, while hot weather turned it into a wearable furnace that made sleep almost impossible. Some medieval soldiers developed personal modifications to their armor that made sleep more bearable. These might include additional padding in specific locations, adjustments to straps and fittings that reduced pressure points, or the addition of removable pieces that could be quickly detached for sleep and reattached for combat. The social dynamics of armored sleep were also significant. Knights and soldiers sleeping in armor were often in close proximity to each other, sharing cramped spaces in military camps, castle courtyards, or temporary shelters. The sounds of metal armor clinking and scraping as people moved in their sleep created constant noise that made rest more difficult for everyone. Medical problems related to prolonged armor wearing and armored sleep were common, but poorly understood in medieval times. Pressure sores, joint problems, circulation issues, and various other health complications resulted from extended periods wearing heavy, restrictive armor while trying to rest. The end of armored sleep practices came gradually with changes in military technology, tactics, and organization. As firearms became more common and effective, heavy armor became less useful and was gradually abandoned by most military forces. Improved military logistics and organization also reduced the frequency of situations where soldiers needed to sleep while armored. However, the practice persisted in some contexts well into the early modern period. Elite cavalry units, ceremonial guards, and soldiers in particularly dangerous situations continued to occasionally sleep while armored, even after it had become uncommon for most military forces. The medieval experience of sleeping in armor represents one of the most extreme challenges that people have faced in trying to get rest while maintaining protection and readiness. It demonstrates the extraordinary lengths that medieval people would go to in order to survive in their dangerous, unpredictable world, even when it meant accepting severe sleep deprivation and physical discomfort as normal parts of military life. As we near the end of our journey through the weird world of medieval sleep, it's time to address one of the most remarkable aspects of this entire story: how completely and thoroughly medieval sleep patterns disappeared from human memory. The segmented sleep system that millions of people practiced for centuries simply vanished from common knowledge, replaced by our modern 8-hour sleep schedule so completely that most people today have never heard of first sleep and second sleep. This wasn't just a gradual change. It was a systematic erasure of human sleep history that happened so thoroughly that by the 19th century, people had forgotten that humans had ever slept any other way. The elimination of segmented sleep represents one of the most successful cultural transformations in human history, changing not just how people slept, but how they remembered sleeping. The process began with the introduction of better artificial lighting. Candles improved in quality and became more affordable. Oil lamps became more efficient and reliable. Gas lighting was introduced in urban areas, providing street illumination that extended the useful evening hours. Each improvement in lighting technology pushed bedtime later and compressed the natural sleep period. But lighting alone didn't eliminate segmented sleep. It was the Industrial Revolution that delivered the final blow. Factory work required standardized schedules that were incompatible with the flexible timing of segmented sleep. Workers couldn't wake up in the middle of the night for personal activities and still maintain productivity during fixed work shifts. Industrial capitalism needed workers who were alert and productive during specific hours, and segmented sleep interfered with this requirement. The natural rhythm of first sleep, watch period, and second sleep was too unpredictable and individual to work with mass production schedules. Factory owners and managers began actively discouraging segmented sleep among their workers. They promoted the idea that sleeping straight through the night was more efficient, healthier, and morally superior to the old-fashioned divided sleep pattern. Workers who maintained traditional sleep schedules were sometimes characterized as lazy, undisciplined, or backward. The medical establishment played a crucial role in eliminating segmented sleep by pathologizing it. Doctors began treating middle-of-the-night wakefulness as a sleep disorder rather than a natural pattern. People who woke up during the night and couldn't return to sleep immediately were diagnosed with insomnia and prescribed treatments to eliminate these abnormal wake periods. This medical redefinition of normal sleep had profound consequences. What had been considered natural and healthy for centuries was suddenly classified as problematic and unhealthy. People who experienced natural wake periods during the night began to worry that something was wrong with them, creating anxiety that actually made sleep problems worse. Religious institutions also contributed to the elimination of segmented sleep, though somewhat inadvertently. As artificial lighting made evening religious services more practical, churches moved away from the middle-of-the-night prayer schedules that had reinforced segmented sleep patterns. The watch period lost its religious significance and social support. Urban development played a role by creating environments that were incompatible with traditional sleep patterns. City noise, lighting, and activity schedules made the quiet, dark conditions necessary for natural segmented sleep increasingly rare. Urban dwellers were forced to adapt to continuous sleep patterns whether they preferred them or not. The rise of scientific sleep research in the late 19th and early 20th centuries solidified the new sleep orthodoxy. Early sleep researchers, working in environments with artificial lighting and industrial schedules, studied subjects who had already adapted to continuous sleep patterns. They concluded that 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep was the natural human pattern because that's what they observed in their contemporary subjects. These scientific findings were used to justify the elimination of segmented sleep practices in the few communities where they persisted. Traditional sleep patterns were characterized as primitive, unhealthy, or inefficient compared to modern continuous sleep. People who maintained old sleep habits were encouraged to modernize their rest patterns for better health and productivity. Educational institutions reinforced the new sleep standards by teaching that continuous sleep was normal and healthy while ignoring or dismissing historical evidence of different sleep patterns. Textbooks, health courses, and public education campaigns promoted 8-hour sleep as the only proper approach to rest. The transformation was so thorough that by the mid-20th century, most people genuinely believed that humans had always slept in single, continuous periods. Historical references to first sleep and second sleep were dismissed as anomalies, misunderstood metaphors, or evidence of primitive sleep disorders rather than normal patterns. Popular culture played a role by consistently portraying continuous sleep as normal and natural. Books, movies, television shows, and other media always showed people going to bed at night and waking up in the morning without middle-of-the-night activities. Segmented sleep disappeared from cultural representation as completely as it had from actual practice. The pharmaceutical industry had strong incentives to maintain the continuous sleep model because it created markets for sleep aids and treatments. If middle-of-the-night wakefulness was defined as abnormal, then people who experienced it naturally would seek medical treatments to eliminate it. This created ongoing demand for sleep medications and related products. Modern sleep medicine became invested in the continuous sleep model to such a degree that evidence of natural segmented sleep patterns was actively dismissed or reinterpreted. When sleep researchers occasionally encountered subjects who naturally segmented their sleep, this was treated as pathological rather than as evidence that the standard model might be incomplete. The economic implications of the sleep transformation were enormous. Industries built around continuous sleep schedules, from factory work to office jobs to service industries, benefited from having workers who were predictably available during standard hours. The entire structure of modern economic life was organized around the assumption that people would sleep continuously during designated night hours. Housing design reflected and reinforced continuous sleep patterns. Bedrooms were designed for single-period sleep, with lighting, temperature control, and layouts that assumed people would go to bed at night and wake up in the morning without extended middle-of-the-night activities. The psychological consequences of eliminating segmented sleep may have been significant, but are difficult to measure. Some researchers suggest that the natural contemplative period that occurred during the traditional watch time served important functions for emotional processing, creativity, and spiritual development that were lost when continuous sleep became standard. However, the rediscovery of segmented sleep in recent decades has begun to challenge the dominance of the continuous sleep model. Sleep researchers working in environments without artificial light have consistently found that humans naturally gravitate toward divided sleep patterns when not influenced by modern lighting and scheduling pressures. This research has sparked renewed interest in the historical evidence for segmented sleep and raised questions about whether our modern sleep patterns are actually optimal for human health and well-being. Some sleep specialists now acknowledge that middle-of-the-night wakefulness might be natural rather than pathological in certain circumstances. The story of how segmented sleep disappeared from human culture demonstrates the power of technological, economic, and social forces to reshape not just human behavior but human memory. Within a relatively short period, an entire way of living that had characterized human existence for millennia was not just abandoned but completely forgotten. Understanding this transformation helps explain why medieval sleep patterns seem so strange to us today. We're not just looking at different sleep habits, we're looking at a completely different relationship between humans and rest that was systematically eliminated from our cultural knowledge and replaced with patterns that serve industrial and economic needs rather than natural human rhythms. The medieval approach to sleep, with all its challenges and peculiarities, may have been more aligned with natural human sleep patterns than our modern continuous sleep system. The weird medieval sleep habits we've been exploring might actually be less weird than the sleep patterns we consider normal today. As we come to the end of our journey through the bizarre world of medieval sleep, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on just how different sleep was for our ancestors compared to what we experience today. Every aspect of medieval rest, from the timing to the environment to the social arrangements, was shaped by constraints and circumstances that are almost impossible for modern people to imagine. The segmented sleep system with its first sleep, watch period, and second sleep wasn't just a quaint historical curiosity. It was a fundamental organizing principle of medieval life that influenced everything from religious practices to romantic relationships. People structured their entire nights around waking up in the middle of the darkness to tend to practical needs, spiritual obligations, and social connections. The beds they slept in were combinations of organic waste, parasites, and minimal comfort that would horrify modern health inspectors. Yet medieval people spent one-third of their lives in these insect-infested, uncomfortable arrangements because they had no alternatives. They adapted to sleeping on straw pallets with fleas and lice because survival required making the best of whatever resources were available. The darkness that surrounded medieval sleep was complete and terrifying, in ways that people living with electric lighting can barely comprehend. When the sun went down, the world became a hostile, alien environment where familiar spaces turned dangerous, and navigation became nearly impossible. This fundamental reality shaped everything about how medieval people approached rest and recovery. Medieval people shared their sleeping spaces with family members, strangers, and livestock in arrangements that prioritized warmth and security over privacy and comfort. They wore pointed woolen caps to prevent their heads from freezing, slept in their daily clothes, and accepted discomfort as a normal part of the rest experience. Their bedtime preparations involved extensive spiritual rituals designed to protect their souls during the vulnerable hours of sleep. They went to bed each night knowing that death was a real possibility and that their dreams might contain crucial messages from supernatural forces. Sleep wasn't just about physical rest, it was about spiritual survival. Religious communities turned the already challenging medieval sleep experience into a form of spiritual athletics that involved systematic sleep deprivation and middle-of-the-night prayer services. Monks willingly subjected themselves to sleep schedules that would be considered torture by modern standards because they believed suffering during rest would improve their chances of eternal salvation. Knights and soldiers sometimes slept while wearing heavy metal armor, accepting extreme discomfort and exhaustion as necessary prices for maintaining readiness during dangerous military campaigns. They developed specialized techniques for getting rest while encased in protective gear that weighed dozens of pounds and made normal sleep positions impossible. Throughout all of these challenges, medieval people maintained their sleep schedules and adapted to their circumstances with remarkable resilience. They found ways to get rest despite insects, cold, darkness, discomfort, and constant threats to their safety and security. They developed social customs and survival strategies that allowed them to function despite sleep conditions that would defeat most modern people. Perhaps most remarkably, this entire way of life disappeared so completely from human memory that by the 19th century, people had forgotten that humans had ever slept differently. The transformation from segmented to continuous sleep happened so thoroughly that historical evidence of different sleep patterns was dismissed as anomaly, rather than recognized as normal human behavior. The medieval sleep experience reminds us that what we consider natural human behavior is often heavily influenced by technological, economic, and social circumstances. Our modern 8-hour continuous sleep schedule isn't necessarily more natural or healthy than medieval segmented sleep. It's just better adapted to industrial work schedules and electric lighting. Understanding medieval sleep also helps us appreciate the remarkable improvements in human comfort and security that have occurred over the centuries. We sleep in pest-free environments with temperature control, artificial lighting, comfortable bedding, and medical understanding that would have seemed miraculous to medieval people. But the medieval approach to sleep also offers some lessons that might be relevant to modern sleep problems. The acceptance of middle-of-the-night wakefulness as natural rather than pathological, the integration of rest with spiritual and social practices, and the recognition that sleep serves purposes beyond just physical recovery are insights that contemporary sleep medicine is beginning to rediscover. The weird world of medieval sleep was shaped by necessity, survival, and adaptation to harsh circumstances rather than comfort and convenience. People made the best of difficult situations and found ways to get rest despite conditions that would be considered intolerable today. Their sleep experiences were weird by modern standards, but they were also remarkably human. Medieval people worried about their safety during sleep, struggled with insomnia and nightmares, sought comfort and warmth, and tried to make the best of their circumstances just like people do today. As you settle into your comfortable, pest-free, temperature-controlled bedroom tonight, take a moment to appreciate how different your sleep experience is from that of your medieval ancestors. Your soft mattress, clean sheets, electric lighting, and uninterrupted 8-hour rest schedule represent improvements in human comfort that took centuries to develop. But also remember that those medieval people, sleeping on straw pallets with fleas and lice, waking up in the middle of the night to check on their animals and say their prayers, were doing their best to survive and thrive in their challenging world. Their weird sleep habits weren't just curiosities. They were practical adaptations to circumstances that required remarkable resilience and creativity. Sleep well, modern people. Your ancestors earned it.